A house becomes a home when it's in relationship to other houses and homes, because, we are relational beings, not just within the home itself, but also outside the home. And so we need to think about the spatial concepts of housing and urban centres and all of that. We set up then a development company, Kaingamaha, and then as the scale of the developments across the country started to grow, we realised that our own capital wasn't going to be sufficient. We often say, you can't give what you don't first possess. This is, I think, why so many of us get into burnout. You need to be constantly topping yourself up, mentally, emotionally, physically, and you can't give out if you haven't been topping yourself up.
Hi, and welcome back to Care Beyond Profit. I'm Azura Ali. In this episode, I'm joined by Israel Cooper. Israel is the co-founder of the Home Group. It is a corporation of vertically integrated commercial organizations that work across the housing value chain. The entities within the Home Group are owned by a charitable trust called the Home Foundation. In this episode, Israel shares how he runs away in the middle of the night as a child, and he restarts his life from scratch. We talk about his experience in social housing and what it is like to build a company and then let it go to transition into governance. There is a ton of value packed in this episode from his personal experiences. If you enjoy this episode, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends who may benefit. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Care Beyond Profits. Let's get into it. Israel, thank you so much for joining me today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Israel. Hey, I want to start with your story in terms of where you were brought up and where it all began for you. So talk us through what was your family growing up like and, how are you here?
I've had a relatively interesting growing up story, especially in the context of New Zealand. So I was born in what's known now as Glorivale. At that stage, it wasn't on the west coast of the South Island. It was just outside of Christchurch in Rangiora. So the first about 7-8 years of my life was growing up in that community. And for the most part, it shaped my view on, I guess, communal life, the benefits of it, and also the downsides of it, particularly when individual human dignity and agency isn't maintained. And so I think that has really shaped a lot of my thinking around this desire to see our communities be both more inclusive and cohesive of all peoples, of all backgrounds, of all ethnicities, but also the importance of individual choice and agency and dignity and the freedom to have opportunities to choose and mark one's own life and journey. So I guess these two things, and they're good correctives to each other. I think, at one end you get to, communism or cults. At the other end, you get to extreme individualism and greed and, destructive behaviors down that end. And so neither are healthy on their own. But together, when we can hold these two things, when we can affirm human dignity and agency, individual freedoms, rights, and responsibilities within the context of a community, where all are treated as equal and having dignity, I think, that's when our societies start to flourish.
Oh, wow, that's beautiful. And for our listeners who might not know about Glorywell, are you able to tell us a little bit more? Because I've certainly read about it online and things like that, but I haven't. You're the first person I've actually met, so I'm sure people would love to hear a bit more, especially given that you've been in the community.
Yeah, well, so Glorywell started, over 40 years ago, close to 50 years ago now, I think, at that stage, just outside Christchurch in the South Island, New Zealand. And it started as a relatively tight-knit church community, but over the years it grew more and more radical in its beliefs, and its understandings and its teachings, and diverged very significantly in many aspects away from the Christian faith they initially started with, and it became very closed off, very exclusive, to the point where people weren't able to freely come and go, and effectively became quite trapped. And then obviously over the generations, people were born inside, they grew up, and they knew no different. They were told the outside world was bad and dangerous and terrible, and this was the only kind of true way to live. And so effectively became brainwashed. And so again, as I said, they lost their freedom and agency to choose, because when you prevent people from seeing, different ways or information, and you feed them particular propaganda, and they don't have that freedom to choose for themselves, and they live in a state that is effectively a brainwashed state. So I lived in that. My father as a young boy, grew up in that. I was born there. First 7-8 years of my life, lived there, and then my father realized how unhealthy this was, and in somewhat dramatic fashion, sort of escaped in the dead of the night with us kids, and took us out. And so, and it's still going now. It's probably, I think, less individuals are living in it. So the founder was my grandfather. He's since passed away. And now the community has become much more open. There's still a lot about it that probably needs to change and is not healthy. But at least increasingly more people are able to leave and able to experience the outside world for themselves.
How was that experience for you? Do you remember much about it when your father had to escape Glorywell, and you had your brothers and sisters, was it? How many of you, and what was it like?
Yeah. So there's 8 of us, and I'm the oldest. So it was a very different world that we came into. As you can imagine, growing up in a community that was pretty closed off and exclusive, to come out into the outside world. I mean, there were simple things like money, for example, was not something that we ever had to deal with. And so for me, as a sort of 8-year-old, this was an entirely new concept to understand this thing, which inherently in itself was not worth anything, but actually was able to do quite a lot, good or bad. And so things like that, and just I guess wrestling with the freedoms that suddenly and the choices. There is a simplicity, I guess, in living in a life where a lot of choices are made for you, and you realize actually the burden of responsibility we have when we have to make the choices for ourselves and bear the responsibility largely for them as well. So, and that's not a bad thing. It just is what it is. And so that was a new thing to wrestle with, as well. I remember growing up, but also just the huge, I guess, horizon of opportunity. I mean, we came out with nothing, very poor. And so we relied on the charity of many, particularly some of my dad's other brothers and sisters who already left the community, and they really supported us well. And I think, we'd always taught in the community, working hard is important. So we had that for us. And so my dad worked very hard, and we all worked very hard. And we had the blessing of a state house for a time. Back then it was Housing New Zealand. And so we had somewhere stable and secure for some of those early years to live, to then start, setting up a life, being able to go to school, and for my dad to hold down a job. And so these things, just again, all part of the journey for me that made me realize as later on in life how important things like stable, secure housing is. Yes, it still requires, individuals to take responsibility and to work hard. But actually, if you don't have that security and stability of a home that is affordable, it's very hard to almost impossible to really, to grasp other opportunities and to be successful in a range of areas if you don't have that.
Oh, wow. And it's a very much a lived experience for yourself. And we'll come to your mahi in a minute. Before we get to that, I just want to ask you, from your experience of growing up, how would your closest family and friends describe you as a person? Because you've been through quite a lot, and I'd love to hear, those who know you a lot, just in terms of your own personality and without the job that you do.
That's a great question. I think I would say that I was a responsible person. I think being the oldest of so many kids, and having to take a fairly significant role in, at a young age, when my dad was out working, single father, the oldest of that many kids, just taking responsibility. So I think I've always had that, and I think people would say I'm a responsible person. I think they would say that I'm relatively innovative. I don't accept the status quo as just being the status quo. And again, I think this is partly my dad's, just he's entrepreneurial, he's a problem solver, and he's taught us kids always that, just because you're presented with a situation or a set of facts doesn't mean it has to stay that way. And so I think I've learned to always question and always challenge and push against, particularly the areas where people say it's impossible, it's too hard. And I think that's why, housing have fallen into that, because it seems like such a big, complex, challenging rock to move. And it is. But I think, being okay with innovation. I think the other thing is I'm a relative sort of creative in that regards too. I studied, accounting and economics at university, and they aren't particularly areas that a creative individual would go into. But I think I've learned that there's a lot of creativity required in some of the work we're doing. And so, creativity often goes with innovation as well. So I'd say those things as well. I think I have a strong sense again, through my dad's own example of generosity again, and also this probably the early life of community. The sense that what I own isn't just for me. What I own is certainly as a consequence of some of the hard work I've done, but it also comes as a consequence of privilege that I have. My parents, the fact that I was born in New Zealand, the fact that we've got a social security system. I'm a white middle-aged male. There's privilege that comes with that in this country. So I have privilege that I didn't earn, but I have a responsibility to use that privilege for the sake of others. And so I think I've realized that that requires a sense of generosity, a sense that what I hold is not all mine. I didn't earn it all, and it's not all for me. And so therefore, I need to use what I have, both in the talents and the privilege and the gifts I have, as well as, financial resources, opportunity, open doors that open to me that may not open to others. There's a responsibility that comes with that for the sake of others, and a generosity that I need to exhibit in using those gifts and resources for the sake of helping others, who don't have the same privilege or the same gifts and talents and those sorts of things.
And it looks like a lot of what you do today has shaped from your childhood. So for our listeners, do you want to just describe a little bit about what you do so they can understand a bit about your work?
My wife and I, about 15 years ago, again, together with my dad and who was involved in those early days, we started a construction company, and that was as a response to help after the Christchurch earthquakes, which, had destroyed about, 60 to 70% of all the residential dwellings here in Christchurch. So we set up a construction company together as a way to really help. My dad was a builder by trade, so he had the construction experience. My, finance and accounting background, I did the business side of things. My wife's, a childhood teacher, but her people and culture and HR sort of ability. And together we started what was Build Tech then, became Home Construction now. And then over the years, as the Christchurch rebuild started to kind of get to, I guess, its plateau, even though it's still ongoing in many ways, 15 years later, we realized that increasingly the need for housing was nationwide. And in other centres, it wasn't as a consequence necessarily of natural disasters like Christchurch, but kind of a human-made disaster, which is, our kind of housing, the economics of our housing in New Zealand, the unaffordability. And that was pushing more and more people to sleep in their cars and on the streets. And so we realized that this issue of people having no shelter and the insecurity of shelter was actually nationwide. We also realized the Christchurch earthquakes taught us that when you are displaced from your home, everything in life gets really, really challenging. And I think Cantabrians particularly saw that. People who ordinarily may have never experienced forms of homelessness or displacement, now as a result of the earthquakes displacing so many all at once, I think people in Christchurch realized how important the home was to so much of life we took for granted. And when you didn't have particularly just the security of a home, school was hard. Holding down a job was hard. Just every part of life just got really, really hard. And so I think as we were involved in the repairing and rebuilding of people's homes, and we saw the impact that, finally they would get their home fixed or repaired, or they get a new home, and they could now life could now suddenly move on. at that stage, they were all waiting. Life was like in a holding pattern, and couldn't feel like you could make decisions around the future, or it was just so hard. The cognitive load was so immense. But once the home was finished, they could move in. It was secure. Life could start again. And so that made us realize, actually, this is really important for humans. This is really important for our cities, and particularly those in New Zealand who were increasingly getting excluded from the housing market as a consequence of cost, of ethnicity, of background. We needed to actually help. So we knocked on the door of then Housing New Zealand. We thought, we'd just rock up and say, hey, we want to help, and it would be that simple. It wasn't. It took us about 5 years to start to try and build for them. While we were waiting on that, we started working for other community housing providers around New Zealand in building homes and just trying to help and support families and schools and communities around New Zealand who had a housing need. As we were doing that, we also realized that a big part of the housing ecosystem required us to think differently about particularly the housing developments themselves. So not just the house, as important that was, but how the houses were, designed, how they were designed in relation to each other and amenity and schools and all of these other things were an important part of community and cultivating community. Because again, a house becomes a home when it's in relationship to other houses and homes. Because, we are relational beings, not just within the home itself, but also outside the home. And so we need to think about the spatial concepts of housing and urban centres and all of that. So we realized that as the builder, we could only have achieved so much. And also the economics of getting housing more affordable. As a builder, there's only so much you can squeeze. And so we set up then a development company, Kaingamaha. And then as the scale of the developments across the country started to grow, we realized that our own capital wasn't going to be sufficient. We had at this stage too, set up the Home Foundation as the charitable trust. And we started the process of gifting the commercial entities into the Home Foundation, which would effectively be the steward of the commercial entities doing the work. And as I said, as our development size grew, we realized that our own capital, this stage was being held in the Home Foundation, was being insufficient. The development sizes grew from 20 homes to 30 to 50 to 80, to 100 plus. And, the profits that we were generating from the construction business and development business were going back up into the foundation. But that was only growing so fast. And so there was only so much we could actually do. We set up the foundation effectively to be the steward of the mission, the Home Foundation. And so the profits from the commercial entities, construction company, development company, would go back up into the Home Foundation. And that grew our pool of capital to then reinvest back into doing more developments. But it was only growing so fast. And as the scale of the developments we're doing across the country started growing, we realized we needed other external capital investors. So we set up Home Capital Partners, which is effectively an investment manager, fund manager that raises third-party wholesale investment funds to invest into housing developments across the country. The other thing we realized is that the communities in New Zealand that were getting built and developed at that stage, and still now, were very mono-tenure. And by that I mean they were quite homogeneous. They were either a retirement community, or it was a whole social housing community, or it was, a gated, high-end housing community. It was middle market housing. And they were all quite segregated. And, all the research that we read and saw was that actually mono-tenure communities aren't necessarily the healthiest communities. And actually mixed communities, diverse communities, tend to be more cohesive over time. And so if you can make communities more inclusive, they're actually better for all of us. And it's not surprising that we have often a lot of problems in some of our social housing communities, because what we've done is we've put a whole lot of high needs individuals together with a whole bunch of other high needs individuals, and wonder why we get, certain problems that escalate. And so, we looked overseas, and in many countries, particularly European countries, mixed tenure, and particularly blind mixed tenure communities were really successful. And so we thought, well, we should maybe try and pilot this in New Zealand. And so we did our first development, Karamu, which was a mixed tenure, so a mixture of some social housing, some owner-occupier, first homeowner housing, and then some market housing and market rental housing. And then our next development, and that was really successful. It still is really successful. And then our next development, Te Pakumaru, was again a blended mix, but focused a bit more on the middle market. So some more affordable rentals and some progressive home ownership to help bridge that link between the sort of affordable rentals and the market ownership. And so these communities are, in a way, tests and pilots of the way we think we should do more housing in New Zealand. Now, the blend has to be done right. You have to have the right mix. The design has to be done right. You've got to design these homes to all look beautiful and, not the social housing to look really different from the market housing and so on. It's got to be blended well across the community and designed well. And also the support structures that you put around the community as a whole have to be really intentional and done really well. And so in the developments we've done, the Home Foundation itself, together with Te Wawa Te Kāinga, which was the fourth and final entity we established, which was our tenancy and property management organisation, provided a lot of extra support and wraparound for the community as a whole, not just those in the social housing, but actually those in the market housing and those first home owners and owner-occupiers, and also the broader, wider community around our developments as well. And we would connect with local churches and local schools and local sports clubs, and we would draw them into the community. And we would, hold get to know your neighbor barbecues. And so we're just trying to work hard to cultivate a sense of community and togetherness. And, when issues arise, we try as much as possible to jump on them really quickly and help the community resolve them. But the idea is we're trying to empower the community over time to be self-sufficient. And hopefully as people build relationships with their neighbors, they realize that, just because maybe someone's in a social housing, they're actually not much different. They want the same aspirations for their kids. They have the same desires for their future and hope as someone who's a first home buyer or an occupier or a market rental. And we're certainly seeing that. The early research we've got from particularly Karamu is demonstrating that fact. Improvements in neighborliness, improvements in cohesion. And so these things we hope in time will just demonstrate perhaps a better way to live. So as I said, in summary, the Home Foundation, which is a charitable trust, which is the steward of the mission, owns 4 commercial companies that operate across the housing value chain. Home Capital, which manages and raises capital finance to invest into housing and keep establishing new housing. Kāinga Maha, which is our development manager who works to cultivate, curate, design housing developments across the country, focused on mixed tenure primarily, but also a range of other housing models. Home Construction, which builds good, high quality, sustainable housing across the country. And Te Wawa Te Kāinga, which is our property tenancy manager, which supports tenants and cultivates communities around the country and the developments and projects that we're involved in. And so all of them are commercial entities, and any profit or return they make from their commercial activities go back up to the Home Foundation, which is then subsequent reinvested. And so what we have is a nice cycle of, we create new housing that's more affordable, better designs, better outcomes, but the commercial return from that goes back up to create more. And so the cycle just kind of keeps perpetuating. And so for every dollar invested, it results in a lot more times around the multiplier effect, and it also gets good social and economic outcomes as well. So
I love the ecosystem you've built there, and a lot of the social enterprises that are trying to build something similar to this are probably wondering, you started off a construction business, and then how did you end up with all these 4 different agencies? Was there a point in time that you thought, actually, we need to keep building this ecosystem? How did you go about it, and what made you decide it was 4? And is this it? Is there more coming?
No, that's a great question. I would like to say there was this masterful blueprint and big strategic plan, and we just kind of executed on that. Unfortunately, it wasn't anything as straightforward as that. It was really just as we got to a particular challenge, a particular need, it was about trying to work a solution. So as I said, being the builder, we were frustrated with designs. We were frustrated with the way communities were laid out and set out. And we realized that we could only squeeze the end cost only so much as just the builder. And so economically, it would make sense if we were also the developer and also the outcomes we were trying to generate in terms of communities that were more inclusive and cohesive and better designed. We need to actually be the developer. And so it was sort of, okay, well, that makes sense to kind of help fix and solve that problem. But also the other thing we saw was that increasingly there were other partners that were popping up who were really interested in that. And so we realized that actually one of the ways we could affect change in the ecosystem is not doing it all, but being a prototype potentially of different ways. And so we realized we could talk all we wanted about how important mixed tenure communities were. And here's the evidence and here's the research. But we realized that unless we actually built one and demonstrated, it's just then talk. So what we've found is that the different commercial entities were set up are effectively prototyping entities where they test and prototype a particular part of the ecosystem or value chain of housing. And look, sometimes we've had projects that have not worked out, and the way we conceived of the actual outcomes have been different. And so we've learned from that, and we've iterated and we've improved on. But as we are starting to learn, we're able to then share those learnings with others by pointing to examples. And so that's the approach we've taken. We're only tiny in the scheme of New Zealand housing. We build between 200 to 300 a year, and our development teams and home capital teams are unlocking probably 5 or 6 times that amount. But again, that's still really, really small in the context of all New Zealand's housing need. And we don't have any great ambitions to grow to a supersize. What we care about is the quality, the health, the flourishing of the communities we build, and demonstrating to others a different way, and then either partnering or empowering others with that information or that knowledge, or walking alongside them as partners to then go and do likewise. And so we see in the future that partnerships with others will be increasingly the way we, scale our effect, our mission, our kaupapa across the country.
That's very beautiful how you describe that. And partnership is such a critical point that you've brought up. I'm really curious in terms of how you got into this. So you've already built this foundation, and you've already got 4 different entities under it. But in terms of, you talked about the impact that you've been delivering has been the focus rather than the scale. How are you finding that you're able to measure it, and what are some of the things that you've seen come out of your foundation?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things we talk about regularly is what we call missional integrity, and by that I mean oftentimes we have been, and sometimes still are, guilty of using the ends to justify the means. And by that I mean, we could say, well, as long as we're producing good quality, affordable housing, how we go about doing it doesn't really matter, or it matters less than those outcomes. We tend to think that the way you build, develop housing, and the system that builds and develops housing and communities is just as important as the actual housing communities you develop as well. So for us, that means the health and well-being of the system that is, funding, designing, developing, building, and looking after tenants. The health of that is just as much a part of our mission as the actual homes and communities we build and develop. And so what that's meant is we've really tried to focus on the bits that we have real agency over. Now, we can't solve the housing crisis in New Zealand, and we can only ever perhaps demonstrate in a small way different ways of conceiving housing. What we are in largely complete control of is how we look after our staff, for example, or how we engage with our supply chain and the housing supply chain, or the contracts we use, or how we set up partnerships and how we support our partners and share information with them transparently, how we operate as a good steward of our natural resources, the products we choose. So a lot of, with the specifications we make, the homes we design, all of these things we are largely responsible for and have a lot of agency over. And so we've tried to focus a lot on the measurement of those sorts of things, because we can affect immediate change around a lot of that stuff, i.e. there's, code standard housing, or there's Homestar 6 or Homestar 7 or now Homestar 8, which is we're trying to build to. So adopting those standards, trying to remove carbon from embodied in our housing, and also carbon from the operation of our homes. Again, designing homes that are inclusive as much as possible of not only different socioeconomic demographics, but also different cultures and ethnics, Pacifica housing, Māori housing, Asian housing, intergenerational housing. So these things we can design. And yes, we all have to operate within an economic system. So we don't operate in this kind of, different world of economics. It's still largely the same reality that everyone else operates, but we try and think well about these things and measure ourselves against improving development on development, house on house. In the construction world, we're measuring our waste. Are we slowly decreasing the amount of waste on each development? So these things we are focused on measuring, and we are measuring them right across our organizations, and also then starting to share that knowledge and that information openly and broadly with the housing system, with the industry as well, and try and encourage change, again, outside our own organizations. That said, in time, we are confident that the developments themselves that we're building, we are hopeful will get better outcomes, but they are going to be much longer term. Families move in, great, you get them off the street, or you get them off the housing register, or they find a secure rental now for 5 years as opposed to jumping around every 6 months. These are good outcomes, and we are measuring them, but they are still relatively short term. The real outcomes that we care about ultimately is the human flourishing ones. So now that you have your secure, affordable, good quality home, what does it do now to your work life? What does it do for your children? What does it do for your relationships within the home? What does it do for your relationships outside the home? What does it do to your health? What does it do to your aspirations for the future? So these things are much, much longer term. And we've got a great individual within our organization, Dr. Jamie Monk, who's our research lead. And she's developed a theory of change, which thinks about both those component parts, the housing ecosystem itself and the outcomes, things like human agency and relationships and health. And so we've now developed this theory of change, and now we're working towards how do we start to map and measure both the interactions between the system and the outcomes, and then also start to measure and track some of those outcomes over time, because they are very much an over time kind of, some of them are really not going to be known until, the next generation, 40, 50, 60 years down the track. But we want to start capturing that data. And we are. We're starting capturing data around the performance of our homes. We partner with an organization called Teva, which allows us to capture a whole lot of performance data on the actual house itself, CO2 and humidity and moisture, all of these things to understand the performance, amount of carbon, all of these things, energy consumption in our homes to improve that. So again, we're getting baseline data. We're able to compare different typologies. And so that's, again, another example of the many areas that Dr. Jamie Monk and her team are working on to really help us to have good data so we can then inform the ongoing system changes that we're working on to again, produce better outcomes.
Thank you for sharing that. In terms of your own personal journey in leading this, now some of our listeners will be founders themselves, and they're also very much aligned with, using profit per purpose. So I'd love to dump into a little bit of that, and also your leadership role and your own personal journey in that space. So in terms of you building this up? What have you had to sacrifice in your personal journey?
Yeah, well, I would. It's been very much my wife and I together, and in a way that's made the journey much more sustainable. Because when I've gone through the depressed days, my wife is hopeful, and when she's um, disappointed, upset about something, I'm hopeful, and so we've complemented each other quite well. We have different strengths and different abilities, and therefore different outlooks on things. And so the things I see as big problems, she's like, "Oh no, we can fix that," and the things she sees as big problems. So that complement has been really, really powerful. The second piece I think that has been really helpful for me as a leader is having amazing people to lead. This has been probably, I think you can just get lucky as a leader, by having amazing people under you who are gracious to you as a leader, and allow you to develop and grow as a leader of them. And so we've had just wonderful people, and a lot of them now are leaders of the organizations. People like Paul Nanai, who now is the CEO of Home Construction, Ramanette Gray, who's the CFO of the Home Foundation Group, David Monk, who's a fellow and our director of a number of the commercial entities with myself, people like Annie Wilson, James Stewart, Lisa Burse, I could list you heaps. And so these individuals have been very gracious and have kind of allowed me to, I guess, learn on them as a leader. So that's been so helpful, because I think leaders, we all make mistakes, and if we've got people under us who's gracious to us, they still need to be honest and tell us where we're falling down. But they're brave and willing to do that, and so I think that's been helpful. I think culturally too, we've worked really hard to build a culture that is high trust, and I think that again makes this, learning to lead or learning to follow or whatever the case may be, has made that happen well. And we've tried to build trust in a number of ways. High levels of autonomy and delegation, high levels of transparency. So, we're owned by a charitable trust now, and so we're effectively publicly reporting. But when we were private, we would share our financial reports with all of our staff on a monthly basis, just so they could see exactly where we were at any point in time. If they had questions, there were Q&A and feedback. And so again, that transparency just built a huge amount of trust within our team. 360 feedback was regular. So staff would feedback on me, not just me feeding back on them. Customers would feedback on us. And so we had a really good perspective of every individual. And so that was really helpful to build trust, and to build really good, quick, honest feedback loops as well. So I think these things have been really important. I think for me as well, I've had some really exceptional mentors over the years. A couple of them now who are members of our board or trustees on the Home Foundation Governance Group, are very wise individuals who really recognize what it meant to be a mentor, which is about kind of coming alongside you and playing the long game. So, individuals like Rob Reed, who, been walking alongside me and Jessica, him and his wife for close to 20 years. And just was that steady source of wisdom and encouragement, and which just gave you so much hope as an individual as you're going through those difficult stages. And so I think, being a good mentor is actually really hard, but I think we can all become good mentors for others. We just got to keep playing the long game and building strong relationships that are trusting. So I think those are some of the key areas that I think have been really helpful for me as a leader. And now, as I've stepped out of the kind of day-to-day leadership of the organization, so I stepped down as chief executive, and we've appointed now chief executives of the different commercial entities. I'm now just a trustee together with my wife and 5 others. And so we're now just trustees of the Home Foundation. We have an opportunity now to, in a way, kind of do a similar role with some of our chief executives, to come alongside them and be their coach and be their mentor. Yes, we've got a governance role and we have to execute that as well. but also just to see now those who are taking the day-to-day leadership, to see them succeed, to champion them, to encourage them, to guard and protect them, is kind of how we see our role going forward. And to sort of just help the organization to continually, be that forward-looking. It's very hard in this industry. There's so many challenges that are present now. I mean, constructions are very much here today. Every day matters. Development deals with current, zoning laws and planning laws and RMA. And so you get very stuck on the here and now, which is right. And we want them, to resolve the issues today. But we are also trying to think, okay, where do we need to be in 5, 15, 20, 50 years as an organization, both imaginatively, what could be, and think about what that might look like, but also strategically to go, well, if we want to get to that, what sort of change do we need to start to affect today, tomorrow, next year, and so on?
And how did you find this transition from being a CEO to going into the trust environment and being a trustee? Now, that's quite a huge one for someone who's built this as a founder as well. Would you like to share some of your experiences and probably what you're going through right now as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's been very hard, for Jessica and I, it did feel like giving up a baby, like they were like our teenager. We had nurtured it through a lot of pain and suffering and stewarded it through these years, and then to kind of hand it over. It was definitely hard on a number of levels. It was really hard. I think what made that transition easier was the fact that the individuals, particularly people like Paul Nanai, who stepped into the role of chief executive of home construction, had been with us for more than 10 years. And so I think there was a strong, trusted relationship with him, not just in his technical ability to lead, but particularly in his care and concern for relationships. And for Jessica and I, that was always the most important part, the relationships that we have internally, the relationships that we have externally, the relationships we have with the industry. This is where all the fruit of good human endeavor comes out of, healthy relationships. And so Paul was very focused on that as well. And so it made that handing over, the relationships with our staff and the relationships with our customers and the relationships with our suppliers, it made the handing over of that, much, much easier than it could have been. It wasn't easy, but it was easier than it could have been. Maybe I'll say less hard than it could have been. Perhaps that's a better way to phrase it. So that was hard. And then I think the other bit is learning to shift from the kind of directive role now to the kind of the coach role. So I'm still working that out. I have not maybe checked back with me in a couple of years' time. I'm learning to, I don't have the decision making day to day. That's Paul's or that's Annie's or that's Jane's. How do I come along and coach them without kind of stepping back in and directing them? And so that's a challenge. I'm learning how to do that well. And also with other staff. So, over 15 years, you build a lot of relationships with a lot of staff throughout the organization. Again, how do I still maintain those strong relationships that I've built, but now kind of with a different posture? I'm not the boss anymore. So again, coming alongside them a lot more as a colleague, as a peer, as a cheerleader, as an encourager, or as a coach. And so, yeah, I'm learning that. I'm learning how to mentor well and to coach well without stepping back in the day-to-day. But it's a challenge. It's a totally different mind shift.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, before we close, I want to touch on 2 last questions. So in terms of, you've talked about your transition here, how do you manage all of the work that you do, and what is your go-to for keeping that stability within your own family?
Well, straight up, it's my wife. So she is very good, and we're good at it with each other, keeping each other accountable around our kind of rhythms of life, we call them, and ensuring that we're attentive to the particular seasons we're in as well, because it does change. There's seasons where you got to be more attentive to, your relationship with each other. And so we've had to focus on our relationship with each other. Then there's seasons you got to be quite attentive to your children, particular needs or challenges they're going through, and then there's seasons at work too, where it just is very intense. And And so I think recognizing a season and being able to name the season has been really healthy for us. And then keeping ourselves accountable within that season. We often say, you can't give what you don't first possess. And so this is, I think, why so many of us get into burnout, and I'm guilty of that as well. You need to be constantly topping yourself up, mentally, emotionally, physically, and you can't give out if you haven't been topping yourself up. So we've had to be quite attentive to making sure we're topping ourselves up regularly. And that's just looked like making good rhythms. So really protecting sort of weekends, for example. We stopped Saturday work a long time ago. We had a process of turning off emails after hours. So, you could send as much emails as you received, but send as many emails as you wanted, but no one will receive them until Monday morning or until, the next morning. So some of these practices, we introduced something called Blue Sky Time, which is, where we pay our staff and take 2 hours a week to just go and do something that kind of tops themselves up, refreshes or revives them. Don't go and do all the jobs at home, but actually just go for a run, go for a walk, listen to some music, sit in a cafe, something that's intentionally going to top yourself up. Long service leave is something we've been attentive to, recognizing that, we're not machines, we're human beings, and actually taking big chunks of time out. So after 7 years, our staff and all of us get 3 months paid leave, where it's just a solid chunk of time where you can just, I guess, become more human again. So
did you take that out for yourself and your family?
Yes, we have. Yeah.
Nice.
So we're about to do that ourselves as well. So those things have been really important for us. And then, a couple of years ago, my wife and I did a bit of a reverse split. She went back to the organization more kind of full time, and I did the home life. And so we kind of reversed that for a year. And that was a really healthy thing for her and for me as well, and just help reset some sort of good boundaries and some dynamics in the relationship. So yeah, some of those things have been really helpful to maintain that longevity.
Thank you. And finally, the last question I wanted to touch on was, if you had to choose one value that you will never sacrifice, what would that be and why?
Oh, only one. Gosh.
You can add 2 if you want.
Good. I would say the 2 would be generosity and integrity. And I think generosity, because as I've shared, I believe the world is not zero sum or fixed pie. I believe there is enough for everyone to have more than enough. And what we all have is not for ourselves. It is partly, but it's also for others. And actually, I think generosity is a way that we actually, if you look throughout human history, the generous acts, big or small, have been really the ways we've moved human flourishing along in great leaps and bounds. I think, so much comes out of generosity, creativity, innovation, service, relationships. There's just so much that comes out of generosity. And one of the biggest challenges of our time, I think, is our growing inequality. And I think that's largely driven, capitalism has been hugely successful in raising a vast amount of the world's population out of poverty. So I'm strongly for capitalism, but I think capitalism has to come along with a sense of generosity, that those of us, as a result of our privilege or our power or our position, who do really well, have a responsibility to be generous to uplift others. So generosity and integrity, I think, because this is not just about being truthful and honest. It is those things, but I think trying to live in an integral life, and I talked about missional integrity, but the same the whole way through. How we do things is just as important as what we do, which is just as important as why we do it. And I think when we start to split these things out, we start to justify a whole lot of behaviors where the ends justifies the means. And we end up undoing some good ends by really unhealthy means. So I think that's the other one that would be really important to me.
Thank you so much. This has been such an inspiring kōrero, so I really appreciate you sharing your personal journey as well as all your challenges and your values as well. So thank you so much, and I really appreciate you jumping on.
No problems. Thank you, Zora. It was a great conversation, and you've got great questions. So it drew out a lot of good conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation and got as much out of it as I did. As always, if this episode speaks to you, please like, share, and subscribe to Care Beyond Profits. I appreciate you, and until next time, keep caring beyond profits.